Ok, bon après-midi. Mon nom c'est Jorge, Sebastiao. Ça me fera plaisir d'être avec vous pour à peu près 45 minutes cet après-midi. C'est toujours difficile vers la fin de la journée, surtout avec une chambre aussi chaude. Alors c'est bon de distribuer un peu de glace à travers l'audience. Quoique je parle français, je peux prendre des questions en français, en espagnol, un peu portugais, peut-être un peu en simple arabe. La présentation va être en anglais. Alors s'il y a des questions, ou si je vais trop vite, bon, on prendra un petit peu vers la fin. Alors ça fait plaisir d'être ici. Et, the topic of my discussion today is something called weapons of mass destruction, I guess version 4, maybe similar to IPv4, but it's an evolution of a presentation that has been growing over time. Of course, trying to make this as interesting as possible, the topics that I'll be covering is, obviously there's a lot of attention being put to that. Although I come from Canada originally, most of my work has been done around Middle East, Africa, and Asia. We sometimes tend to refer these as emerging markets, depending on which perspective. Of course, around the Middle East, these kind of attacks and this kind of technologies is extremely important because we're looking about protecting critical infrastructure. And here, when I refer to critical infrastructure, I primarily talk about oil pumping business, which obviously is helpful for the rest of the world. We'll look at target attacks, specifically Stuxnet and upcoming variations and some of the implications. When we look at this new world order, I guess we can look at from the cinema perspective or Hollywood, but in reality, in the real world, things are slightly different, or maybe not so slightly different, as we can see a lot of similarities between what is happening on the big screen as well as in reality. Of course, these kind of attacks are not new. We'll pick one or two in particular. More specifically, if you go back a few years, the CIA actually took a specific chip and introduced some logic bomb in it, which destroyed a gas pipeline. And as you can see, this kind of attacks have a direct implication on the economical consequences of a country. At that time, Russia was coming out of tough economical times. If somebody destroys the capability of you collecting cash to feed your people, the implications are extremely high. More specifically, at Stuxnet, it started appearing a little bit sometimes in a funny way, but we'll refer to this in more detail later. But what you actually see on the screen is not exactly what is always happening in real time. Now, it started appearing in the press somewhere between 2010, 2011, but in reality, the attacks predated much earlier than that. We're talking probably 2008 or even earlier, or at least 2008 as documented. These kind of attacks, as we tend to refer them, maybe from a statistics perspective, an earlier speaker also alluded to that, they call them persistent targeted attacks, which is really funded by people that can afford it because it takes a long time. They require a lot of customizing and investment, much well beyond the capabilities of much of the networks that we have been referred to. And they typically tend to target infrastructure of a country. If you look at Estonia a few years back, you can look at this as the public sector being targeted, but specifically Stuxnet, it looks at things like manufacturing or critical infrastructure of a country. When we look at traditional mass attacks that are maybe designed to collect small amounts of money, which turns out to be a lot, when we look at targeted attacks, there is very unique features associated with that. The way they actually propagate across the network, the way they attack the network, the way they choose the victims, and how they take the information from those victims or how they create destruction within that environment. And the idea here behind a lot of these attacks is not to be perceived, because once the attack gets known, you have to move on and reinvent the wheel to attack further. Specifically to Stuxnet, when it was discovered around 2010, at the time we talked of it as a complex attack, over 100,000 lines of code, but we'll see very quickly that more complex attacks are coming on board. It used zero-day exploits or specific vulnerabilities against the Microsoft operating system, one would look at, well, why infrastructure industrial attack will actually attack a Windows operating system. One would not expect the two to coexist, but there is actually a very tight connection between and the reasoning behind it. And the reason is the Windows operating system is the tool that is actually being used to program the logic control unit, which is actually driving the industrial system that in this case is being infected and being destroyed. Now, it's always nice to try to describe things in slides, but I think in the case of real life, it's always better to actually see a video that puts things in perspective. So I've chosen two videos during my presentation, so I'll play the first one.
7 software installed, and you need that software in order to access the PLC and to program the PLC. Here's the PLC that we're actually going to program. We're going to download our program on here, and we're going to show how we can control the PLC. The PLC is connected to this air pump, and we're going to use this air pump to inflate balloons, and we're going to use proof of concept code to show how Stuxnet would be capable of interfering with the process of programming the PLC and controlling the pump. So the demonstration that I'm going to show is I'm going to program the PLC to inflate this balloon for 3 seconds. Then we're going to infect the PLC, and we're going to download the same program to inflate the balloon for 3 seconds again. But when the computer is infected, you'll see that the PLC behaves differently from what we expect. So to program the initial PLC to inflate the balloon for 3 seconds, I use the software step 7. So in step 7, you need to open up the code block OB1. And inside in the code block OB1, I have this timer here set for 3 seconds. 3S is the important command here. This timer is going to run for 3 seconds. It'll turn the pump on until this timer is finished, and when the timer is finished, it'll turn the pump off. That's turning the pump off here. So what I do is I download that onto the PLC. It asks me, do I want to overwrite the code that is already there? I say yes. Okay, so now this code is on the PLC, so we can test our code out by turning on the PLC. So we see that the code worked as we expected it to work. The balloon inflated for 3 seconds. So now what we're going to do is we're going to infect the PLC, we're going to infect the computer here, we're going to download the same program onto the PLC, and we'll see that the PLC behaves differently the next time. So to do that, I need to close all the software, infect the machine, and then open up the software and perform the same steps again. So here again, we look at OB1, we see that our code still says 3 seconds, and we're going to download this onto the PLC again. At this stage, the computer is infected, so we don't have control of the PLC. So what we think we're sending to the PLC can be intercepted by the threat and can be rewritten. So it's asking me, do I want to overwrite the code that's already there? I say yes, the same as last time. So now this code here that will run for 3 seconds and inflate the balloon for 3 seconds, that's what we should observe here when we turn on the PLC.
I guess when you see this pop happening to your own industrial systems, you kind of get the picture. What it really means is that the operator is obviously looking at a screen in front of him. Everything appears to be operating correctly, but what is actually happening behind the scenes is something completely different. So Stuxnet, created somewhere around 2008 or earlier, went through a series of steps until it was actually discovered, but the primary objective was actually to infect the PLC. More specifically, to infect a specific Siemens-made PLC, which is the one that is actually was being used in Iran. So it was actually targeting what's called WinCC, which is the controlling system used to program the PLC. It used a several rootkit approach with zero-day non-known Windows attacks. And one would expect these kind of industrial systems not to obviously be connected to the internet. So the original infection was done via USB. So it combined various techniques, obviously not traditional infection as we see today. And once it infected a particular machine, then it could easily propagate through the network and look for the proper targets. And it created a botnet which could be controlled remotely. It could be remotely updated with refreshes of the attack, etc. So if we look at the overview of this particular attack, the target was a nuclear plant. The victim was a specific country called Iran. The motivation was actually to delay or destroy as much as possible the centrifuges which are used to enrich the uranium. Obviously, the compromise was based on a combination of traditional attacks, as some of the previous speakers have talked, but also on social engineering, which was a previous talk as well, because it involved the use of a memory stick, and it involved specific vulnerabilities both on the Windows and the Siemens system. Now, result was over 1,000 of these centrifuges got destroyed, delayed the program, and after some time, organizations like Siemens were forced to actually patch their system as well. So this entire propagation system obviously started with the infection via a USB stick, which means there obviously had to be some compromise of specific resources which had physical access to the plants or the enrichment plants in these locations. Once this was done, then it used to propagate via USB, via a print server or via Windows server, zero-day attack, and then simply propagate across the local area network, which one would not expect it to actually be connected to the internet. And from there on, it obviously created as much damage, and we'll see a specific example of how that damage was done. Today, one can actually test for this specific attack. It is available on the Metasploit toolkit, so you can easily do a simulation of such attack. Other things that are probably important to note is these kind of attacks, as some of the ones I will be talking later on in the presentation, use anti-forensic techniques. They are designed to remain as hidden as long as possible. And they are trying to be very, very targeted, and they basically hide their tracks as best as possible so they are not becoming discovered earlier on. This is what the Siemens Thematic PLC looks like. You have the control system that you saw earlier, which is a Windows user interface, which is called WinCC. Once the right programming is done of the PLC, then the program gets transferred across. The interesting aspect about this specific attack is that the operators in the Iran enrichment plants were looking at the console that controlled this PLC, and everything basically seemed to operate as it was before. So they were basically hiding the feedback. So the operators saw everything as running normal within the plant. Another interesting aspect about the attack was the amount of research and funding that went into doing this attack. In the first part of the presentation, I looked at the propagation, infecting Windows with zero-day exploits, but to actually attack Siemens-made industrial-grade tool, it requires a lot of research. And this research was basically done using resonance. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the term resonance, but anything that is built today, whether it's a car, a building, or a bridge, has a resonance frequency. And if you can reach that resonance frequency, basically that building, that car, etc., will self-destruct. The best way to actually try to describe this to you is to show you another quick video. So everything that exists has a specific frequency. What really happens is when you actually reach that frequency, which is different for each object, the object basically becomes completely unstable. So you can imagine what was going inside those centrifuges when you reach the right level of frequency. is important to highlight here, you can quickly imagine the amount of research, testing that went on to actually make sure that the exact amount of damage was actually being done. So you had to have access, also you had to have very tight cooperation with the engineers that actually built these centrifuges in the first place as well. So in the case of this specific device, when it reached a certain frequency, these devices were basically self-destructing. Now, you don't want to be one of these centrifuges, of course. The interesting aspect is also how this got distributed. It quickly became clear that this was targeted at specific countries. But of course, as any malware that is created, although it might be with a specific purpose, it tends to always outspread its bounds. So it actually infected other locations like India, Indonesia, etc. So although the primary large number of attacks were in Iran, other countries like Indonesia and India got extremely affected as well, although in smaller numbers. And also this got infected as well in specific countries where also the Siemens was being used. So you can quickly imagine that if you were sitting in South Korea or so, your system might actually be infected and you have a side effect, and you are basically being called, sometimes I think we tend to refer to this today as collateral damage. So now, obviously the result was the attack on this specific critical infrastructure, specific enrichment in nuclear plants in Natanz and Bushiri. It caused 60% infections in Iran. And obviously the objective here was to delay this specific program. This was still earlier on. No country at that time claimed responsibility for any of such attacks. As a result, Siemens, after long periods of time, was forced to actually patch the system. And what is basically started to happen is everybody started looking. If this can happen in Iran, what about our own critical infrastructure? We run electrical plants, we run water plants, we run trains, we run all kinds of systems that have SCADA systems built in. And these own systems have obviously vulnerabilities associated with them. And what is really important here to note at the end of the day is any kind of attack you launch is a bit like a boomerang. You know, you throw something, but it may come back to hit you. And what I mean here is important is that your own infrastructure may be extremely vulnerable. So you need to start looking at the homegrown impact and how to actually control and mitigate potential future attacks as well. So here, there's specific security assessments that started being built specifically for SCADA systems and looking at how to basically control them. Now, Stuxnet started to getting out of the news, people forgot a little bit about it, and all of a sudden, things started to happen again. Something strange. Specifically, United Nations organizations contacted ITU in certain certs and saying, some of our data is being deleted and it's disappearing, and we don't know why. So people start having a look at this. Specific security organizations looked at this into more detail. Although the number of infections was relatively low, Again, very similar to Stuxnet, which went over 2 years. Flame also, although it was discovered around 2012, it initiated around 2010. So for a period of 2 years, not people really had an idea of what was going on. Obviously, the infections were much lower, but the kind of damage and the approach was completely different. Where the previous attack, the objective was to actually destroy in a very flagrant way. Flame is kind of a two-way approach. One way is to conduct espionage, and I think some of the previous speakers described this in quite amount of detail in the sense that it can steal specific files, especially diagrams, can get information from your mobile phone if it's using the same Bluetooth and it's paired with the infected workstation, can listen to your camera, to your recording device or output-input devices within your PC, etc. Things that are a little bit different is the size. We always thought Stuxnet was big, 100,000 lines of code. Here we have another one that is 10 to 20 times bigger, much more modular. We're talking about in the neighborhood of something like 20 megs of code. Of course, it's not going to download 20 megs of code all at once to your machine. It's going to download in initially 6 to 7 megs, and then based on the type of attack that it requires, it will download the specific modules. Interestingly enough, it's not using traditional assembly or C, C++ languages only, but it's also using Lua, a gaming language. So it looks like a new set of resources have basically been employed to actually been used it. Obviously, gaming languages are very well known to be real-time and very flexible in their approach. So you can quickly see the adaptation of this as well. This specific virus obviously has the capability of delete files, and by deleting files, it obviously became visible. Along with this attack, then they started a series of, you can say, controlled leaks in the press. And as these leaks became kind of non-repudiated leaks, or normally when the leak happens, governments will come out very strongly as we deny any involvement, it's nothing to do with us. Specifically, these specific attacks, which started well before the Obama days, known now today as Olympic Games, was a series of very well coordinated approach to actually target specific countries that were considered obviously enemies of the state. Now, is Stuxnet, Flame, obviously the only ones? Obviously not. There's other ones that we are not talking here in this presentation, but certainly are worthwhile for you to research when you go back, like Dooku and others as well. What is important to note is that there is war as we know it traditionally, and there's a cyber war. And although we are looking here at cyber war as a new way to causing damages in a completely different way in the critical infrastructure of a country. If you look at the job market, they want you. So if you have the right necessary set of skills, you look at Pentagon ads and others, they want you to help build this new generation of weapons. A good friend of mine from Wyabeck, Bruce Schneier, made a statement just a few days ago called Stuxnet is a mistake. Well, some people may agree with him, some people may disagree with him. I kind of have the approach that I disagree with some elements of his statement, but I do agree with some. In a sense, if you look at a country like Iran or some of the countries that are being affected, like Pakistan, India or so, their infrastructure is obviously not as advanced. But think of Stuxnet or Flame as a very strong weapon that you're throwing at your enemy. Your enemy is not necessarily using a lot of electronic capabilities within their own infrastructure today. But if you look at Europe specifically, if you look at North America like Canada or USA, SCADA systems are all over the place, and all these SCADA systems are still using very old Windows systems, not well protected. So the weapon that you throw at your enemy could easily come back to affect you much more strongly. And from that perspective, I agree. We have always this statement that say, if your house is made out of glass, don't throw a stone at your neighbor. Because obviously, especially in the electronic age, it's very easy to clone these tools and modify them slightly, and they become obviously much more strong weapons. When we look at critical infrastructure, which is a side note important to this presentation, Homeland Security has looked at very specific 18 elements of that infrastructure that are important and required to be protected. Now, it's not just protecting one. A lot of these systems share information and are interconnected. And any of those systems can easily impact the day-to-day operations of a city, a country, or a state. And as you can see, the implications can be financially extremely damaging to that country. If we look specifically at cyber war and rules of engagement, if you read the press a few years ago, military and Pentagon made the statement that if you attack us with cyber weapons, we have the right to attack you with traditional weapons. So if we look at the statement made by Win, which is one of the speakers tomorrow, a few years ago, there's an ongoing or undeclared war which has been going on for over 12 years, which is China regularly attacking the USA through cyber weapons. Now, this may be at specific California companies by stealing information to advance their own commercial interests, but at the end of the day, commercial interests are vital to the country as well, or today more like the Iran war, be it started in 2008 or earlier and now 2012. So one has to look at the difference and the implication of this new generation of tools. Now, to wrap up a little bit my presentation, a lot of us here are working for security companies or have worked for security companies at one point in time or another or related to them. Now, there's something here that you should be worried about. We're working for an industry that claims that we're protecting our clients. And if we look at the case of Stuxnet, we didn't find anything for 2 years. We look at Flame, we didn't find anything for 2 years. What it really tells you? It tells you that all the technologies that we're promoting to organizations or our clients are broken, or they simply don't work as documented. So that really means that you need to go back and revisit the approach of protecting your own organizations. I think Win is also presenting on this tomorrow, but being a mathematician myself, I like this simple equation. P must be greater than D plus R. P stands for protection. It's a notion of time-based security. Now, as we move on over time and we have these zero-day exploits, P equals 0. That means by default, you're attacked now and you cannot defend yourself because the tools that you use for defending don't know about the attack, so obviously they will not help you at all. The second important aspect is the other side of the equation, which I call the D plus R. D stands for detect, and R stands for response or defend, depending on the perspective of the language you use. But the protection or the level of protection should be greater than the time it takes you to detect and respond. So assuming that P equals 0 and you get attacked immediately, what really matters to you as an organization today is how agile are you at detecting that you're attacked and how quickly you can respond to that attack. That really means the capability to, for example, disconnecting yourself from the internet. Now, is that going to fix the problem? Well, Estonia discovered that it did not fix the problem. If you remember 2, 3, 4 years ago, Estonia got attacked. They say, okay, we will disconnect ourselves from the internet. So during the first week, they were attacked from outside. The second week, they were attacked from inside. They say, okay, how do we solve that problem? So the kind of attacks that we see today are much more complex, and just simply a disconnection is not necessarily the proper response. And that brings me to the next real point, which is we as security specialists need to start thinking a little bit outside the box and looking at technologies, approaches, methodologies, frameworks, and etc. that are really helping the organizations that we're trying to serve, and not just simply sit down and kind of say, oh, our job is done. No, our job is barely being started with the tools and approaches that we have today. Now, let me finalize the last part. One always assumes that the most strong countries with the greatest technologies are the best ones because they have the best technology behind them. One never forgets that the first virus was actually created in Pakistan. We sometimes laugh about that country, but if you actually look at the Pakistani virus, which used to be distributed in floppies, I mean, things that don't exist today anymore. If you actually look inside the code, it says Pakistani virus. It actually has the address of the guys that made the virus. And if you go there today, you'll still see the guys sitting in the same house. So you can actually visit them. There's a video about that, not the purpose of this presentation, but maybe a future one. And this specifically new generation of attack that was discovered in Pakistan is quite unique. And again, it illustrates that all the technologies that we have today, either in information security or even in SA with all their massive globulings of information is not going to be able to necessarily detect the attack. It was discovered actually by pure coincidence, in the sense that one of the laptops of the attacker, they found this piece of code. And this piece of code was quite interesting. And the purpose of this piece of code was to distribute information between 2 points. So what they were actually doing with this piece of code is I want to send you a message, and I want to make sure that that message does not get intercepted. So what they were doing is very simple, taking the message, breaking it down into small components, let's say 2 or 3 components, of course, encrypting each one of the components using different methods and sending them using different ways. For example, part of the message would go as an email, part of the message would go as an IM, part of the message would go as an SMS, etc., and then being assembled at the other hand and being decrypted. What that really means today is that technologies that we're using, might be siphoning all that information, you'd be completely blind to this kind of attack. And that's all for my presentation today. I hope it was illustrative of the work that we have ahead of us. And I think later today and tomorrow, the next speakers will illustrate further the point that I'm trying to make. Thank you for presenting to you today.